Hello guys, and welcome to the second part of this practical tutorial where we get to simulate an SQL injection and secure the endpoint. In the last video, we simulated the SQL injection and we saw what could happen, the damaging effects of an SQL injection, the ability to get more than what we needed and more than what we should have been able to get using this kind of input, and we're able to accomplish that because we did a direct binding and concatenation of our parameters to our query. So today we are going to be, or this next session, we are going to be looking at how to avoid scenarios like that, how to secure the scenarios. And the primary option here is safe parameter binding, okay? And so it's to change this query. But usually there are two steps which you can implement for this very basic level. The first one is input validation in a sense, and this can be done in the front end when using a UI, or in your API when in the service layer in the validation section. So what this can do is and I'll explain, is we can sanitize the string, and sanitization is basically removing unwanted characters, okay? So we can have a function, so we can have a helper, a service, I don't know, we can have another method here, or let's say package, where we can say util, it can be, is it utility? It can be like a helper function, and we can have a class in it that can go validation, validate, validator, and we can just make this an interface. We can have a validator interface here, and for those of you who don't know, this is basically an abstract class and allows us to define our methods here and then create another class to implement it. And in this case, we're going to have public boolean. You can have a, let's just say, void. Could it be? So it is going to take a string. So you can have public. It returns a string because it's going to take a string. Validate, and we're not validating user, we're validating an input, which is a string, right? And we're going to have, and it's going to be input, right? And we're going to have this as our particular method. We can name this method maybe sanitize or validate, whatever this is, okay? And what we're going to do here is we're going to create an implementation class, validator, okay, and this is going to implement validator, and then we are going to override public string validator input class validator. And essentially this now will have to validate the string which we input here. And remember that the first thing we want to do for things like this is we want to trim the string. We want to go so input dot trim. So I hope that, let's say, what does it say? Result of trim is ignored, so we need to put it in a result. So we input equal to input.string. Remove redundant assignment. The value input.string assigned to input is never used. Okay. And we're going to check if it is empty, then return input cannot be empty, but this is really not, we don't care about this. If we send an empty string, we don't really care about it, right? So we can do like validations, and this is where our validation will come in. And in the controller now, you can ask yourself, does the input need to be empty or not? So we can check if input. So we can have the if input but empty, and rather than returning input is not empty, we can throw an error here. We can throw a validation exception here, which empty string, okay, and we can create this error using so I am just going to go through over this, and you don't really need to understand this for now. We are going to be handling this when we're going to be talking about errors, exception handling, when we're talking about fault tolerance, and I'm just creating this in order to show you. But just to talk about it is, these are situations where we need to, throw an exception, a warning in the system saying that, okay, this validation has found an inconsistency with your input, and we are saying that there is an exception, there is a problem in this particular input that you're sending here, and we are telling the system. Now the system now has to catch this particular exception, okay? And we can do that by creating another package called exception, and this package is going to host all of our exceptions, okay? And we can have a class called global. Oh, sorry, that was. So we can have a class called exception handler. So it could be like a global exception handler, just one class, global exception handler. Um, and this will use the annotation controller advice to handle the exception, and then we are going to do some other stuff. Right, so we're going to program our exception in here. I think I've forgotten how to do this. Is it like public, global exception handler? No, I think it's an annotation. And I think handle exception handler. No, I think it's handle exception or handle equals to exclude. Kind of forgetting what to do here. Anyway, we'll get to that, but we need to create a class so yes, in the exception we need to create an exception class which will be what's the exception which we threw validate exception. So we'll create this exception class right here. There we go, and we're going to skip that. And so it's going to take the exception, it's going to take the message string and it's going to pass it to the super. Yeah, so the global exception handler now. So since we have this here, we can go back to the service, so the validation, and we can import this class here to remove the error, and we can say empty string, So we can just put a generic, say, fields not empty. Okay, and this is the kind of error messages I talked about when return generic error messages. So we check if the particular input is it's empty. We want to throw an exception, and this exception is going to be gotten. Is going to call the validation exception that we created, and then the global exception is going to pick it up. So we're going to have controller advice here. There's something I've forgotten what it is. Another is um is it like public? So where I'm trying to get it to, I know that is, I know some of you are laughing at me there. I've just forgotten what you're supposed to do there. But you're supposed to, I think you get like annotation. Yeah, let me see. Let's go to Spring Boot and look at the documentation of creating controller. And that's the fun part about Spring Boot. Just going to go Google, going to go creating controller advisor in Spring Boot. So Spring Boot will have its own controller advice annotator, public class example advice 1, public class example advice 2. We can also specify the controller in the for it to handle. So, oh, is it like REST controller advice? Does that work? REST controller advice. There we go. So we have like the yes. So we have REST controller advice. So anyway, so the Google like public the message. No, that's the exception. Create the error response model. Error handling for REST Spring. Oh yes. Yeah, the network is acting up, so I'm facing difficulties to get that information from the internet, from Spring Docs. So yeah, the network is not the best right now. I could pick it up from one of my other projects. I just want to no. Oh, so this is sanitization we're talking about. We'll talk about that later. Okay, so I'm just going to try to pick it up from one of my other projects. So just bear with me here. Okay, your window, controller class, exception, exception handler, REST controller advice. Yeah, I know that there What's an exception here? It's what I'm looking at. Exception handler. This is what I was looking for. Example I found. So let's controller. Then you get the logger. I don't care about the logger too much for now. Right. So exception handler. So you get a class, and then you get the exceptions. So what we're going to do is add exception handler. We're going to have the well, we don't really care about the class. We just want to throw the string. What class in there? Like public. And return the string. Handle. I think it's handle validation, exception, and then we pass something in there. So I hope that's correct. Because yeah, we have user not found. Oh, okay. So this is this is the exception class we are handling, and then we're going to pass the error message and the web request. So we're going to go web request and user not found exception. So the exception type. So we are going to create validation exception, right? And then the web request. The request. Then we are going to, of course, look into that. Yeah, we logged in. We don't want to log in. They will just return the new thing there. So we return get message. But here's the thing. We're not returning we're not returning the status code, which is what we're doing here, and that's because our endpoint, our controller, is not using a response entity. Well, at least we're creating a basic one this time. So can you annotate? I don't know if you can annotate HTTP here, like the status code HTTP or response. I think it's response but response status dot, or we have HTTP. I think bad request. Oh, can we do that? So we just return this with the HTTP codes here. So I'm going to check this. I'm going to check this here. And that's, yeah, so I'm just double checking just before I run it, just to make sure that we don't get, but we can also just leave it there and then we check it later, okay? So we can check it when we're running it, but I just thought like checking it with the AI, but okay, let's leave the AI for now. So I don't know if this will work, but this is the exception class, and this, hopefully we are trying to pass in a body so that when this gets returned, this returns with this status, right? But I don't know if that will work. We'll see. Public string, and then we create the handler function, and then we basically just return the message that was returned here. Okay, and that's all. If we look at my implementation here, it's the same thing. Okay, so I don't know why it's there, but anyway. Let's see, hopefully I'm right. So have validator implementation, field should be implemented. So we throw an exception when the field is empty. And then if the field is also empty, so this is how you handle exceptions. So if the field, so we check if the field is empty. So check for blank. empty fields, right? You have to now, all we need to do is check for, so we can do two things here. We can check for characters, special characters that we don't accept, okay? Or we can simply find those characters and replace those characters, you get? So what can happen is, usually it's better to simply just check for characters that you don't accept, right? Or maybe because you return special characters, they might try multiple different kinds of special characters. You might want to just, get the special characters and then turn them to something else, to like an empty string. So what we'll do here, we can replace special characters with, no, let's find, check for, let's check for special character. Let's check for special characters. Okay. So we are trying to make sure that only characters we accept. So we can go, I think, string, input, not to lowercase, dot match all things. Input dot matches, yes, so that is, no, that's not what we want. So I have a regex here as a regular expression that I kind of got last time. So we can, I don't know, what does this regular expression say? A to Z, A to 0 to 9, escape. Right, so let's understand what this regex will look for. Okay. So let's ask our AI, let's Google, what does this look for? Put that matches greater than color. Internet doesn't work well. So I think there's a regular expression. Okay, I think I have one here. So basically, of SQL, yes, it finds the slashes, and this is a simple, this find and replace all, but I want to match that. Yeah, right. Okay. I think this just fine for regular characters. Yeah, I think that just finds, that just looks for regular characters, and it's not what we want. Okay, so the main problem we have here is to know whether or not what that regular expression talks about. But essentially, I wanted to find characters that are not, I don't know if this is it. I don't know what the regular expression is, so the truth is I cannot really tell you with confidence what all of this means. Okay, it's been a while since I kind of visited regular expressions, so I just wanted to understand it. But I think it it finds normal characters from A to Z, small letters A to Z, big letters 0 to 9, underscore, and then it escapes, dash, and then two escapes again, and then bracket close, plus that. And this, I don't know if this is negating all of these. I don't have no idea. So I think that this just finds all regular numbers like stuff, and we can test that out. So basically, if so, here we are supposed to check. So regex for special characters like that. Dash. We can have dash. We can only have underscore. We can have passport can have the dash. Okay, passport can have the dash there. Yeah, so but this one we can only use it. So now that I think about it, okay, for the password we want the password to be stronger, and so special characters are kind of advised for password. Okay, if we use this to detect matches for password, then we have a problem. All right, so we can leave this, okay, because parameter binding will take care of the SQL injection problem for us, and we want to make sure that you can still use special characters in your password, right? And so we can okay, so since we already threw in an exception here, we can change this method to validate a boolean. We can just do a void. It doesn't have to return anything. So yeah, we can just do a void, so that when there's an error, it throws in the exception. It throws the exception. So we can have different validations here. Okay, we can have a different validation depending on the input we are trying to validate. And we don't only have to have one class, right? We can create this validation for the user, and we check for the special characters, right? And then we have another validation, like we can have this as user validation class, and then we have another class called password validation where we don't check for special characters. Okay, and all of that can be implemented. And I just want to keep it simple here. Obviously, if it was internet, I would check for the regular expression for that. But well, I don't have internet apparently, and it is slow. But we can also just find all the the special characters that we are looking for, and then we replace them. Find replace all. We can use the replace all. We can use input dot replace all. I think replace, yes, something like that, and then we now input our something. We can input our strings, something like that, which is a single quote. We also want to like do other things here, right? Or maybe like a dollar sign, an percentage, right? Maybe a dash, an underscore. depends on what you are trying to find here, and this is going to find all instances of this, and then it's going to replace it with that. So and so you could do a whole lot of other things in here. So, but right now I'm going to keep it singular, right? I'm going to keep it as simple as it gets because I just want to use a single validation just to demonstrate the validation issue, the validation thing here. But now the real security comes in when we are doing, so this is a user repository, when we're doing the binding, okay, we need to use parameter binding, and this entity manager has a particular method called parameters, I think set parameters or something, and so we have to change this query. So we're going to use, we have to change both queries, but we should just do this one for now, since it's what we're going to be testing, the endpoint we're going to be testing, and essentially we want to do the same thing, right? So we want to select all from users where user is equal to, and the query goes as such. We don't have all of this, okay? We have user equals to, and then it's going to be username, right? And then we have an password equals to password, something like that. And so this is how you write the query, and these are basically variables, and these variables we have to set them, we have to set the values of these variables in this other query down here, and I think it's going to be dot set parameters. I think it's set parameters. Yeah, set parameter, and then we're going to go for username, and then we'll go comma, and it's going to be username. There we go. And so you can just bring this down so that we have another one. Dot set parameter, password equals to password, and then we're going to execute dot execute. I think it's okay. Execute update. So this returns a single ID. Alright, so this will return a single ID, and then we are going to use that ID to find the user information. Okay, so we'll simply just return the ID, and we're going to confirm it in the database. But basically, if we wanted to return the entire user object, we could use the ID. We could run another query, which would use var user equals to user manager. No, that's not SQL. So we could do another string. User SQL. It should be select all from user. Well, and you know what, we don't need to do this here. We can create another method. Again, should not, again, single responsibility principle, you know, we should follow that design, but we can just create another method, public. We can do public. um, we just want to return a user, and we don't want to find by username, we want to find by ID, and we want to get an integer, ID, right? And what we need to do is prepare the string of the SQL. So we like SQL. Select all form users where ID, and then it's equal to bind parameter. So since that's an integer, and we're just if we're going to use this internally, right? So we are getting the information just here. We can just pass the ID directly, right? ID equals to pass that, right? So with ID, okay. And that'll be it. And then now we'll simply entity manager, create native query user class. So with a dot get, we get single result, right? And this will return. You can just return that. Just can return that user object, and we can just cast that to a user object. Yes, and so right here we can, you know, we have gotten what set the parameters, and now we've gotten ID. We can simply get the user. We can do a variable user equals to so we could just put this private just to make sure we're using it just within the class. We can do find by ID, and we do result. So we can even change this to be user ID, right? So we can send a user ID here just for proper naming conventions. And now we have the user, and now we need to return the user. So if user it's not null, yeah, I see. And what if the user doesn't exist? We can return null anyway, because here we are not checking for if this user exists. We also have to check here just before we send it. If this user doesn't exist, it's going to shoot an error here. Anyway, we can handle the error when we see it and understand it, because we need to check if the ID is actually something that can be passed in here. But anyway, we have now our user, and of course this takes a list of user. But again, remember the initial one doesn't take a list of user. But you know what, let's leave it at that just to show you that only a single result is being returned. Because the first time, so if I'm going to, the first time when we ran this, more than a single result was returned. So we have our user. Then we can do say user dot to list. New array list user dot to lists. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Alright, so it gets returned as a user. No, we don't check, we don't do that. I don't think we cast that. Do we? Do we? List of array user. Interesting. So this is basically the parameter binding. This is the most important part to prevent SQL injection. What this happens is it passes the string that the user sends as just a string. It doesn't do anything else. Right? It doesn't allow it to be passed as part of the query, but just the string. So it is regarded and evaluated as a string. Okay. So when we send the same query, we should have a much more different result. Okay. So the first time we sent a query, remember we had multiple results. This is what we got using this. However, if we try this again, we should be getting an internal error because it wasn't found, right? So no parameter named admin blah 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 in query with name parameter password. Yeah. So you have an internal error. So unknown parameter exception, and we can try. So so what's happening here is that when we run this, okay, it puts the username in here, and this is it, right? It does this. Does it have to be like a string format? Did I make a mistake somewhere? Yeah, maybe I did. Maybe I did. Does it have to be like this? Anyway, let's see. But I think now, okay, yeah, I think that is the point. It's just taking this and putting it as a variable. I hope it is. Let's try that again. And let's see what the error gives. No parameter ID in query with name parameter. So saying no parameter named admin. So we have binding. Sorry about that. Let me go right ahead and just remove that. And so no parameter named admin, or that's, I'm guessing this is the entire parameter. Um, oh, I think is this the one that has to be in the string format? Because yeah, it's passing username as the parameter. So I don't know if this is the one that has to be in the string format. Yeah, hopefully. Because what is happening here is saying that it's trying, we're defining a parameter this, but then we're not defining too many characters in the character literal. Username, executable password. Let me see. Set parameter object int object username. Oh, sorry, set a string. Yeah, so we have to have like a string. Yeah, so let's see. It's a string, it's the object. The object is the username. So what is it saying? Cannot resolve query parameter string. So we can have, I think it is that. Is it? No. That. No. No. Yeah, so bear with me. I am scrambling here. So username equal to username. So see, cannot resolve query parameter username. So I'm guessing yeah, so right now we're passing the parameters right, but it cannot be resolved here. So not sure why that is. Is it like a single quoted string? No. No, no, it shouldn't have to. Yeah, so it's not resolving this here and here. Yeah, the parameter is a string. It will pass an object, which is the username, but it cannot resolve this parameter in the query. So basically, I thought it was. Oh, I actually have something here that I did. Yeah, where username equals to username. Not sure. Oh, was it query literal? Okay, so I get it. So it, I think it's something like that, and that's why. Okay. Think something. Not sure. Like a text block. Yeah. Okay, so that makes it all correct. So sorry about the confusion here, okay? And then we'll have like a username something. So select all from users. Where username? Yeah, and so on and so forth. Yeah, I know I've not yet used our validate, but you can see I am having some issues. I don't know where they are coming from. So select all, and then we have the bind parameter. Yeah, set parameters, username to get list. Like at this point, I am probably spelling something wrong or doing something else. And even if we had to copy the exact same thing, okay, even if I just had to copy, let's just say this one, and paste it here. Okay, so what's the difference between this and this? Now I'm just curious. We have a 3, select all from users, where username is equal to username and password equal to password. Do I have to break them down as it was broken down here? Doesn't make sense, does it? Okay, so it doesn't. Okay, so yeah, it still produces the error. Create native query SQL user class. So I don't know why it's giving me the error. Yeah, I have no idea why it's giving me an error. So yeah. It's saying that we cannot resolve query parameter username. It's a parameter here, cannot resolve it. I don't know if it's, maybe it's just, let's try. I think it's still going to give me an error. It will give me an error. I just don't know where it's going to give me. Yeah. Okay, I think it's one. So this is just an error. I thought it was like a fundamental error because it's highlighted in red. So I've been really killing myself here thinking it's a by saying that cannot issue execute updates or execute large update with statement that produces results set. Execute update, get result list. Let's see, get result list. Yeah, so that is going to return a user class. So we could just have a user. And Yeah, that returns a result list, so we could return that directly. Does it? Let me have a create query. Entity manager. Dot create query. There. It is returning Java valid. No, I think it's yeah, you're getting the same result. It's result class. Yeah, I don't really like SQL. It's not properly documented, so it's really difficult to find those errors. So we will not need this anymore. Okay, so we can do a parameter binding. There we go. We have a 200, although we send it, it found nothing and returns an empty array, empty list. Right, and that's what you get here. And that's what parameter binding does for you. Right, sorry, this has been a roller coaster. But if we decided to do the username, as John Doe, as we did the last time, we should get a single result, and there we go. And that's because that is actually found in the database. We added it in the last video. Okay, so you see the difference between the parameter binding. It's that it takes this user provided input here and pass them as a single string object rather than part of the query. Okay, it doesn't just add it and concatenate it, it safely passes them as a string. And so when it evaluates all of these, right? All of this particular thing here as a single string, as it should be evaluated, rather than, a command. It evaluates them as a string, and that's what the setParameter allows us to achieve here. So I think I've been confused because the username sets red and stuff like that, so it's not been the best for me. You can see the error, so I was like, where is the error coming from? But it turns out there is no really an error here, because I think so I think we need to link a data source for this kind of these errors to go. Okay. But now we could do a validation just before, or in our service layer, we could call in. So when we have a validator, we could get Spring manage it by annotating it with component. Okay. For the component validation, do we need to where's the validator? I think component here. Oh, so I think it's here. Component. It's here also. Do we need it here? I don't think we do. Right? I think we do need it here. So we'll see in the service layer we can auto wire that in. Right? We can do private validator. Private validator, right? And we can auto wire this in. That's field dependency auto wire. So we have, and now we have our field injection for the validator. We can do in the login, we can validate, validate username. Yes. and we can also do validator, validate password. Okay, so if we run this particular query again, so your validator can be very complex, but this is just a simple check to show us what you can do with your validation logic. So you can have multiple validators, extend the validation interface. And if we run this, we are going to get an empty string because nothing matches. If we do the John we're going to get a single match. As always, that's the information. However, if we have one of these, again, that's also that our exception here, it's kind of really good because we did a global exception handler and we sent a HTTP response to be a bad request when we hit this exception, and that is what you're seeing here as a bad request. That's 400. So it's a bad request. Fields should not be empty, and that is exactly what happened in our validator implementation, where we say that if it is an empty field, then we should throw an exception says field should not be empty. And that, my friends, is how you validate your input, at least a basic validation. This can go as complex as possible. You want to check for the particular input, the type, the length, the and other properties that you can check for the particular input. So this particular validator can be extended to check for different properties, and you can filter out properties and throw different kind of exception to make sure that you give the appropriate response of the appropriate error message in this right here. And also always remember to send back your status code. And as you've seen, we have sent back a 400, which is a bad request, and we're telling that this request that the client sent is a bad request. Remember, in the 400 family, it's all about client error, and this error is from the client. So the field need to be not empty. So your field should not be empty. And you see, we're not telling you which one is empty. So if, say, we're supposed to check for special characters, we can tell you your field should not contain special characters here, and the client has to figure that out themselves. But this, your field should not be empty, so it's going to look there's an empty field, and when it puts one there or something there, then that error goes, and we simply just get no information. So there is no user found here. And we can do that. We can check this array in here later on and ask ourselves, so in the user service, we can, when we return, before we return it, we can check the value returned from the repository area and see if it's an empty array. We can also throw a particular, so if this is a login, right, what can happen is we can do a var, right, equal to, so we can do a var user equal to that, and we can check if user equal to null, or I think user, I didn't say user dot then we can return. So we can throw another error, right? User up. So we can throw another error. Well, invalid request. We can put a not found error. So if it looks like a shared, so we can throw a user not found. Exception. Okay, and we can say bad credentials. Okay. That's all. We can just put it, and then we can create now the exception class. In the exception, can create this exception class here, which again use the exception to give us a boilerplate code, and then we can now catch that exception in. We can do add exception handler, and then we are checking the exception class, the user not found exception class, and then we are also going to do a response status, and we're going to return HTTP not found, and then we are going to run the code, which is user not found exception, and send that, and we're simply just going to return the message dot get message, right? And we actually are returning a string rather than, so we return a string and we're going to get exception just like that. Okay, so if here in the user service, the exception is, so we're going to import this. If we've run the query and there is no user being found, there's no user found, right? It's an empty array. Then we want to return bad credentials, right? And that is going to throw that exception and going to throw user not found. Else we can just return user. Okay. And if we run this class, if we run the entire application again, we can test this out properly. Okay. And then we are going to get a for bad credential, right? So it tells us the bad credential, but it doesn't tell us whether or not the username is the problem or the password is a problem. It just tells us that it's a bad credential, so the user with this credential is not found. And these are the kind of information you want to give, rather than saying that username not found, password, user with username is not found, or password is incorrect. It gives too much information, so you want to keep it generic for your error. And also remember to always send back your status code, because your clients are going to use this to determine whether or not the request was a success, and if it's an error, what kind of an error it is, right? Because if you don't send this can be it could maybe be a server error, and the client might not know what is. This can be correct, and this could be a server error, and the client can still be changing it, knowing that the fault is on your end. But sending a request tells the kind of error. If the client looks at it and says, okay, this is an error on my part, so I'm going to try to change whatever it is I can change to make sure that it meets the requirement of the endpoint. And in this video, we have seen safe parameter passing using the setParameter function in the entity manager. We have looked at validation techniques, which we have seen, and you can structure this very differently. And we have looked at handling exceptions in a very brief way, and these are some of the good practices when creating an API. You want to make sure that you pass your request. You want to validate your parameters or your user controlled inputs. Then you pass them safely into the query to make sure that they are not being evaluated as part of the query but as strings, right? So they are not executed as code but just read as strings as they are supposed to. And then you want to handle different exceptions, and then return the valid exception. Now, during this phase, we've seen some other type of exceptions, which is SQL exceptions, and those exceptions you can handle them, but those ones are not being returned to the user. Those ones can be logged, right? We will see logging later on in the series, where we get to log in certain exceptions, and thus we log in exceptions that are basically errors generated from the server side, right? Because those exceptions are things that we did not consider, or faults that we do not we did not really take into account in doing our design decisions. So we want to log in those exceptions into a log so that we can later on go and review that log and see what happens and try to fix the errors. The logs can help us replicate the errors in a different server apart from the production server, allowing us to debug and deploy fixes as frequent or as necessary. So this has been a very good tutorial, although there has been a bit of confusion on my part. But again, this is part of being a software engineer, right? Working on several projects. You are not you learn the concepts rather than the stack. I'm a Java engineer, but it's been a while since I coded in Java, and in this series I'm just coding again in Java. But as you can see, we are figuring out it's not the concepts don't change, they are similar things, and you can just take them from past projects like I did here, and or you could use the Google Docs, the Spring Docs like I have been doing ever since, and you could use the internet. There is no shame in not knowing, there is no shame in looking things up. It is part of the cycle, it is part of being a developer, it's part of being an engineer. Okay, you cannot know everything, even no matter how smart you are. So even simple things like these regex expressions are something very complicated, and you really want to make sure that you know what you're doing there. So this has been an interesting one. Thank you guys for watching, and if you find this helpful and very informative, please give it a thumbs up, like, share, subscribe, and comment your thoughts and your questions in the comment below. Relevant information about the repository and my socials are are in the description in this video. Um, Next class we are going to be looking at I'm going to try to look at path injections that allows us to use some particular validation logic of our path to help us prevent those path injections. That said, thank you for watching and see you in the next video. Bye.